Will the PS5 see off all its contenders? And what will PAX Australia look like now that it's going to be virtual?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm not joined this week by Adam Turner, who's taking the week off to really fine-tune his Donkey Kong skills. I keep telling him the secret is to run headfirst into the barrels, and somehow he still keeps on believing me. But that gaming link is even more apt this week because we've just seen the formal reveal of the PlayStation 5, the online-only PC gaming show, and quite a bit more. Because in a normal year, we'd be in the thick of the middle of E3 season, but this year is obviously different and everything is entirely online. So, to go over the latest in gaming, as well as to peering into its near future, I've grabbed two of Australia's finest writers with a keen interest in gaming. From Kotaku Australia, we once again welcome to the virtual Vertical Hold studios, Alex Walker. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And we've also got a new guest in the studios, editorial director at CNET Australia, the one and only Mark Serrels. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Hey, I'm here, finally. I've always wanted to do this.
We've always wanted to have you. It's great to have you here. So let's dive into the PlayStation 5 first. Its timing didn't quite coincide with when we wanted to do the last episode. But early last Friday, Sony sort of took the wraps off what we can expect out of the PS5. But to me, I don't know, it sort of felt like a lot of other E3 conferences. There were a lot of trailers of things we might not see for a few years. Were there any really standout surprises for you, Mark?
I was really, I was honestly, sincerely surprised that they showed off the design of the console. So I wasn't expecting that. I'd gotten a sort of sneaky heads up about a lot of the games that were going to be shown. So I had a rough idea of the games that they were going to reveal. But the console itself, I didn't know that was coming, one. And two, I didn't know it was going to look like a Razer gaming chair. That kind of shocked me.
That's a very kind description, I think.
The fact that it looks the way it looks and the fact that they showed us what it was going to look like was the big surprise for me.
Alex, were you taken with the design?
I mean, you've got to appreciate all the memes that came out. Like the obvious one was that everyone was linking it towards their, the router that they got given with their NBN. Or people are like, hey, I've already got the PS5, and it's like that ancient, like tiny radiator or tall sort of aircon you'd buy from Big W. So that was quite good. There was someone actually, they photoshopped someone's face onto it. So like the PS5 was kind of like a white pop collar.
Yeah, that was my favourite. That was my favourite.
I rather liked the Eve from Wall-E ones myself, but yeah, it lent itself to a fair bit of mockery. And I don't know, there's part of me that thinks, look, it's not the thing that you look at. What you look at are the games. Was there anything there, Mark, you said you had a bit of a heads up. Was there anything there that really said, yeah, this is the thing I want to get a PS5 for?
I mean, a lot. I actually thought, in terms of the games they showed off, it was pretty solid. Like, I was really taken by, I'm really into Horizon Zero Dawn, so the sequel to that, I'm super all in. What else did they show? I really liked a couple of the indie games. I think Little Devil Inside, I thought just had this really unique, interesting art style. The thing that really surprised me and that I really loved about this conference is that they kind of showed their big AAA titles like Horizon and Spider-Man, and they put them on an even keel with all these smaller, independently produced games. Whereas, normally in reviews like this, they'll show off their Halo or their Metal Gear Solid or whatever the big game is at that time, The Last of Us, and then they'll do a 5-minute montage of all these indie games, and you see 2 seconds of each one. But this time they took they gave these games the space they deserved, and I thought that was really cool. And I came away really excited about like a huge number of games I'd never heard of and didn't even come close to know was coming. So I thought that was my biggest takeaway from that.
What about you, Mr. Walker?
Yeah, I think there was. Firstly, it was kind of so very, very close to being like, Sony got it right. I actually had that sitting in the drafts for a while, and then there was the massive kerfuffle about what was happening with Spider-Man, Miles Morales, because
Hmm.
it was announced, this is kind of everyone's like, cool, that's a Spider-Man 2 that we thought it was going to be, and it was what everyone had pretty much heard about inside the industry. And then a Sony executive comes out and says, it's kind of like an expansion bolted onto the existing game, and everyone's like, "Wait, what?" So is this like kind of DLC you play after the end of the original Spider-Man? So does that mean Spider-Man is automatically getting ported over to PS5, which kind of actually would make sense because if you think back to when they showed off the SSD for the PS5, they showed it off with Spider-Man. That's how they did the cutaway, and eventually Gorilla had to come out 24 hours later and say like, no, this is a standalone game. It's not like DLC. It's not an upgrade. It's just its own thing following on. And that was kind of that's very sort of executive. Like this was not. You don't have to the messaging. Like it's just you know how to do this very cleanly and simply. And for the most part, that's what Sony did really well. Like if you go back and look at what happened to the Xbox Series X reveal back in May, where they had to apologize 24 hours later for talking it up too much, Sony learned from that and got it really quickly. They're just like, okay, here's a couple of people talking. We're not going to stick Jim Ryan in your face for too long. You want games? Here's some games. Here's a couple of developers, Insomniac, talking. There was a little bit from Guerrilla, it's the ones who are working on Horizon Zero Dawn, and otherwise it was just everyone got a really decent amount of airtime, and I think like that works really well, especially for games like I'm thinking Kubo on the Two Strings, but that's actually what the game it reminds me of. It was a very sort of Pixar esque Kena. That's it, Kena Bridge
Hmm.
of Spirits.
Yep.
And it kind of just looks like that little sort of young female protagonist with all of that sort of like elemental time manipulation, working with spirits. That's the kind of stuff that you want to see from a next generation. You want to see something that looks like it could be from an animated film. Because like we don't expect our games to be fully photorealistic. We kind of prefer it when they're not, because you get into that weird sort of uncanny valley territory. So to have ones like that, there was also what the Goodbye, the high school one. God, I can't remember the
Volcano
name.
High.
Volcano High.
Yeah, like something like that. That's an excellent thing to drop. Like that's something you would expect in like a Guerrilla Corrective, or sort of like a side publisher showing during E3. Not, hey, this is our console bang for the PS5. So they did a really good job.
I think the days of expecting these broad, grand, like visual upgrades from consoles are sort of gone now, and mainly because visual upgrades don't necessarily require power nowadays. They require like resources from development teams. It's like if you're going to create all these like high res 4K models and etc. etc. It's not necessarily an issue of power. Now it's more an issue of like imagination and also the resources required to put these things into play. And so that's what. So like Alex is completely right. It's like we're seeing what we're seeing is a real visual wow now in these things is interesting directions. Not oh my god, look at the polygons. This is so beautiful. It's like no, this looks different and weird and interesting. Like Volcano High jumped out at me a million ways just for that reason. And the other thing that I was going to mention was the jump between consoles is a bit different nowadays as well. I get the sense there's going to be this real long transition phase between the PS4 and the PS5 where games like the Miles Morales game and potentially even Horizon Zero Dawn will probably come out on the PlayStation 4 as well as the PlayStation 5. So that kind of dampened it a little bit for me. I think there was one game where it said designed exclusively for the PlayStation 5, and that was the only game that said that. The rest, I'm assuming, are going to come to PS4 as well, and I think a lot of them did say at the end of the trailer PS4 and PS5. So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep track of as well. When will we stop having these big AAA games coming out on both consoles? And to a certain extent, will they be hampered by the fact that they have to be made for both consoles.
Well, there's also like I think Godfall was, and they did that much earlier. I think that was the first next gen one where they're like, "Oh, this is exclusive. Like it'll be
Yeah,
PC.
that was the one.
It's being
Yeah,
built exclusively
Hmm.
for the PS5." And I think that's partially because this is the first console generation in a very long time where we've gone from one generation to another, and those they're all built on the same architecture. So it was
yeah,
using AMD, like the Jaguar CPUs and the on-built GPU for the 360 and the PS4, whereas the PS3 before then had their custom built um, cell
yeah.
processor, and there was different stuff in Microsoft. Now it's all the same architecture, right? So moving from something like Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5 is not as big of a step because they don't have to retool it. They don't have to basically figure out some weird emulation layer to get it to work as it was supposed to work. It's just, okay, you've got more power. There are going to be some games that run into issues because they were, and this is me being a bit derogatory, but they were just coded badly, and coded badly in that their frame rates were tied to the whole game speed. So if you throw more power at them, they're going to start running in really weird and wild and wacky ways. This happens a lot in Fallout and Skyrim. If you ever seen what happens when people try and run that at extra frame rates. But for the most part, things will just port over fairly simply without much trouble, which means that developers and Sony as well can just start thinking about all the other things that we do during development that kind of have to hide all the cracks. So one of the things that Mark Cerny was talking a lot about was with level design, how you get forced into elevators, or he was specifically using the example of like mountains when you go around corridors and things. And that's specifically done by programmers and level designers, specifically so they introduce an artificial amount of time so they can
Mm.
load assets in behind. Even games recently still do this, like Final Fantasy VII Remake. You're going through the reactors, like the amount of times you go through. Here's a control room. Open a door. Run up a hallway. Open another door. Like that's designed so the game can continue functioning without it, like actually tanking into the single frame rate digits. So, what do next gen games look like now that some of those streaming restrictions are pulled away a little bit? Because we know that it's not going to be largely developed towards ray tracing. We already had the experience of that on PC, and most developers only opted for like fairly light inclusions, maybe some like odd reflections here or there. But for the most part, they realized that the trade-offs were just not worth it. So they go,
Mm.
okay, like let's maybe make the maps bigger. Let's maybe try and support more NPCs on the map, or do something more interesting from a design perspective. Um, and of course, that was a trap that Microsoft fell into because they were showing games that were having all these extra features, but visually, they didn't have visually distinct styles. So the takeaway that a lot of people had from the gameplay was like, oh, well, this doesn't really look like next gen, does it?
I guess that's true. I mean, I must admit, I was kind of waiting for a jaw drop moment graphically around like all of the X's and bubbles and little interstitial things that was suddenly going to reveal as a hey, by the way, we're doing this in real time, or something like that.
Yeah.
I think you're right, Alex, but I think it's a harder sell to say to people, hey, you'll just get less loading times, which is not everything you've just talked about, but it's probably that top level consumer thought. One of the other things that they did though was they showed off two models. There's a digital and a model which is going to have a Blu-ray drive on the side of it. I'm probably the most traditional amongst the three of us in terms of liking having a physical collection. But am I a dinosaur? Is digital going to be the model that people actually buy?
Sony at this point can't really afford to not create a console that sells like the traditional games discs that you buy in JB Hi-Fi or EB Games, right? Because they also need those outlets to sell the console, and consoles are traditionally a loss leader for the games themselves. So it's such a tricky position to be in. Like, how are you going to sell your consoles if you're going to tell like outlets like EB Games, well, you're not going to be able to buy games on these things in your store. So that's always going to be a challenge, and I think it's one of the reasons why we're still tethered to box copies of games. I think the reality is that more and more people are buying games digitally. I know I am. I prefer to have it digitally to the point where I actually pay more money to have a digital copy versus like going to a price match like EB Games price match in Big W for some ridiculous price. So it's an interesting sort of dance that Sony and Microsoft are going to have to do with the retailers. I think that's a large part of this. Um, Personally, I will definitely be buying the digital only version, just because that's how I prefer to play my games. But I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't hugely care about whether I'm playing a game with a disc or whether I'm playing a game, digitally. Like, there's no difference in performance or anything, right? And most of the experience of people who are buying a game through a disc are, so I don't have to deal with a stupid amount of download time, and that's going to increase a little bit more with the next gen Blu-rays, which can take up to 100 gig, which I believe is the size of one Call of Duty update or something. Is that where we're going these days?
About
Yeah,
half a Call of Duty, I think.
yeah.
Yeah. It actually blew me out when like you had things like Aussie Broadband were saying like, oh, by the way, this spike in our network is because of a COD update. Like that is just
It's
insane. Like that's gonna triple. Like think about that in 2 or 3 years when like GTA 6 drops a day one patch and it's like 60 gig. And like the NBN just stops. Period. Like but in terms of Australians, we have the reality that like games can be significantly cheaper at retail. And particularly the last couple of years, you look at something like Fallout 76 was selling for like 52, $54 from JB Hi-Fi and a couple of other places a week before it went out. Can you imagine going back like 4 or 5 years and be like, hey, you could pay $100 on digital or you can pay like 52 for Fallout 3. Like you would have to pay like much more full price for that. And that's partially just because of the position that retailers have been in. So it makes it a more competitive um, element, particularly with stuff like Switch games, where the digital proposition is just not that high. It'll be interesting for Xbox more though, because PlayStation has the advantage where they don't have a price competition from PC, right? But that's for Xbox, they're constantly fighting against PC. All of their first party exclusives are things that are going to be launching concurrently on PC and Xbox both digitally and physically. And if Xbox are pushing people more and more towards services like Game Pass, that also means those people are going to be looking at other sites that offer CD keys for cheaper. So it's more of a battle against, do I want Game Pass and do I want to go through that ecosystem, or do I want to buy on a third party site altogether and keep with my friends in Steam? Like they're actually into very like, we pitched the consoles against each other, but they're actually fighting two very separate battles in a way.
They're still fighting for consumer dollars, though. And I wanted to get onto this as well because for both Microsoft, where we do know a certain quantity about what they're going to do with the Xbox Series X, and obviously PlayStation has now started talking more. What we don't know, though, is the actual price. Mark, why don't we know how much these consoles that are launching this year are going to cost?
I think there's a bit of a Mexican standoff between the two of them. No, they're kind of like it's like the good, the bad, the ugly. They're just sort of all staring at each other in a long, protracted like sequence where they're like, "Who goes first? Who announces the price first?" Because I get the sense that Microsoft will have learned a lot from the like quote unquote failures of the Xbox One. I think one of the big advantages the PlayStation 4 had back then was that it was cheaper. I can't remember how much cheaper, but a significant amount cheaper and more powerful at the time than the Xbox One. So I think Microsoft's goal this time is like lose money on a console, take the hit there, get the install base out and massive as big as possible. Because I think Microsoft's end game is a bit different from Sony's end game, and this generation especially. I think you're going to start to see them diverge a bit in their strategy. So Microsoft is working on stuff like Project X Cloud, right? They're talking about streaming streaming games straight to your mobile phones, straight to TVs, straight to PCs, etc., etc. They're thinking about that, and more importantly, they're thinking about Xbox Game Pass, which is just such a big proposition for them. I think Phil Spencer had even came out in an interview and said, it's more important for Microsoft to increase the subscriptions to Game Pass than it is to sell units of their console, which seems insane, but it makes sense in the long term. Sony doesn't really have that mindset. Sony's strategy is definitely more traditional, and that's the big question for me heading into this next generation. How does this play out? How do these different strategies play out, and how do they impact the consumer? I'm really interested to see that because I'm a recent subscriber to Game Pass, and I'll be honest, it's really changed the game for me. I'm not in a position where I'm buying less games because they're on Game Pass. Playing games that are on Game Pass instead of buying new games. Um, and I think a lot of consumers will be like that this generation. It's a crazy good service, and Sony doesn't really have a good answer for it.
It's also kind of like you especially look at a recession, something like Game Pass is an incredible value proposition, but it also means like, hey, if all this stuff's going to come to Xbox One, why look at either the PS5 or the Xbox Series X? Like if I'm going to get most of it anyway, and most of the year you can buy Xbox Game Pass for $1 a month, like it is crazy, crazy good. There's also the other element too that people forgot a lot about in the early days of the Xbox One era, but Microsoft has been way better set up in the data center category, to the point where like it's kind of
Mm.
always been like a running joke with PlayStation about like how their network works, and especially in the PS3 era, there was some outages, data breaches, and just like slow download speeds. But now it's like gotten to the point where Sony has done that tie-in deal with Microsoft to use Microsoft Azure, which they're going to need because they can't expand PlayStation now without having a range of their own data centers. And data centers are expensive to set up. They're especially expensive to set up if you're going against, the big three of like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, which Sony can't afford to do right now. So they have to pair with Microsoft to do it. Um, and that's kind of Xbox has always been way better set up. So when you look at the future of things like xCloud, again, Microsoft's better established there. They're probably the leader when it comes to cloud gaming if you compare it
Yeah.
to Nvidia and especially Google Stadia, which has been a tragic failure on all fronts.
Well, Microsoft's been transitioning into being that services company for quite a long time now. I mean, it's services all the way. Whether you're talking what used to be Office 365 and is now Microsoft 365, Xbox is sort of just another wing of that. So I think that all makes sense. Where does all of this leave Nintendo? Because if you want to talk about bad download experiences and bad online, they're still back in the dial-up era, aren't they?
I really think Nintendo is in a great position currently. The Nintendo Switch is just a completely different beast. It's
Hmm,
my favorite console I've ever owned. In terms of
that's
what
a
it
big
does and
call.
the way, yeah, I mean, it's up there. It's definitely in the top two or three. I mean, I love it, and it's sold out everywhere. You cannot buy one for love nor money. Um, it's just a beast right now, and they're playing a different game and have been for generations. Ever since the Nintendo Wii. I don't see it as being a threat at all. I see Nintendo continuing to make like a buttload of money and do it, and just Nintendo will just continue trucking along whilst Microsoft and Sony just sort of outgun each other.
It's also like put pressure on the cost of PlayStation, particularly. There was a really good Bloomberg report from earlier in the year about how the cost of bills, so like how much it costs Sony for DVD drive or Blu-ray drive and all the rest of the components had gone up because the lack of supply for things like flash memory and RAM had soared, because they're fighting not just with smartphone manufacturers, but they're also fighting with companies like Nintendo. The amount of sales that the Switch is selling is putting pressure on the other companies because there's just less supply of the components they need to make these consoles and get them out to people. And you add that in with the COVID pandemic, which means that, even if they're able to manufacture some or most of the parts, they can't necessarily ship them all at the same time, or they can get the parts they need, but they can't assemble them because they've got problems in that factory. It just drives all of the costs up. And the longer that situation goes out, the better it looks for Nintendo too. Like PlayStation has already put out emails and sort of feelers to people, saying from a consumer level, like get your interest in early because like we'll have some consoles at launch, but we're not going to have a lot, you know, and that's just a really, really strong situation for Nintendo because they don't need to fight on console costs. Nintendo has always made money on every console they sell, unlike Sony and Microsoft, and they also just don't have to worry about the issue of making people upgrade to things because they can say, well, you can take your game around wherever you want. Like, that's such a strong argument. And still, like, even if you look at how xCloud and streaming works, it's really not, it's not even a rival argument.
So E3 is also obviously about hype for games, and one of the later events in the year on the local calendar that would also add a lot of hype to that is PAX Australia. But there was bad news regarding PAX Australia this week, wasn't there, Alex?
Yeah, so PAX Australia has announced that, well, they initially announced it as a postponement, but what it is a cancellation as far as 2020 is concerned, at least for the physical event. Most physical conventions had been cut or transitioned to an online only event, and PAX Australia, as we know it, is doing the same thing now in its place in the middle of, or second week of September rather, which is important because it's not clashing with Cyberpunk, which is very good. They're merging PAX West
Priorities.
and PAX Australia into an 8-day, 24-hour online virtual event. It's kind of similar to some of the, what we're seeing now with sort of some of the non E3 things, and it's effectively just going to be a rolling live stream of different panels, gameplay, and all of the things that would have been at either of those shows, but it's just going to be virtualized.
So, as long-term listeners would know, I did my first PAX last year. In fact, Alex, we chatted there, and the one thing that I think made PAX stand out for me was that sense of community. And obviously, you can do community online, but it's not quite the same. How do we think that they're going to get around those kind of challenges? Because I think it's very much part of their identity, isn't it?
Yeah, community is definitely a part of PAX's identity, but what funds PAX doesn't necessarily get as much from the community element because PAX has always been split into a few sections, right? From a consumer facing part, you've got like the tabletop area, you've got like the big expo hall, and then you've got the panels. But what it kind of is effectively a large amount of like brands and developers who are coming in and buying sort of FaceTime. So you look at your EB Games, but also your Sony, Bandai Namco, all of those
Hmm.
publishers, right? It's a chance for them to drum up hype with regular customers with whatever E3 or Gamescom demos they had from that year. And then it's an opportunity for, the other sort of local stores and like manufacturers like miniatures, tabletop, that sort of thing to then occupy the rest of the space. And the panels kind of effectively function as a promotion into those two areas, right? Because there's no real money in people hosting panels, and most of the people that do it aren't paid. They do it out of community. So PAX Online kind of doesn't have that as much, which means a lot of the big draw cards that drew a lot of people in, and especially would have done so this year, being able to see a PlayStation 5 in person and try it before you buy it, being able to see Xbox Series X, try it before you buy it, Cyberpunk, maybe if you're on the fence about Avengers, new Assassin's Creed Vikings, which I know is not its name, but that's what I'm calling it until the end of days. Like all of those things are kind of not on the table anymore. It's just kind of like sit back and watch it like a virtual event. So like there are still going to be sort of communities that coalesce around like individual sort of streamers and games, but the end effect is that like the amount of actual engagement that everyone is going to collectively have is just going to disappear a bit because you don't have that physical sort of attachment of everybody's in the same space. So kind of let's hang out. You're competing with the distraction of everything else. So they've kind of actually tooled it in a way, understanding that people might only drop in for one or two things over those 8 days because you can't capture everyone's attention.
So, Mark, they're also talking about it running concurrently, also there's sort of as a replacement for PAX West as well in the US. How much impact do you think that's going to have on the local side of it? That sense that this was a game show for Australia. If we're also kind of getting the American side of things, is that a benefit or a drawback? Do you think?
I think it's a benefit. The drawback is money, I guess, right? Like, what's the name of the company that runs PAX again?
Breed pop.
Reed Pop. They
Yep.
make their money through ticket sales and they make their money through selling space on the show floor, right? And that's all gone. I'm not really sure how the model's gonna work with a digital only event. I'm assuming they might charge for tickets that so people can have access to live streams and watch and stuff like that. And I guess that works. But for local developers, it might be a good thing. Like PAX Australia is big in Australia, but it's not. It doesn't have any global reach. And if you're an independent game developer, for example, the Australian market is tiny for you. What you really need is global attention. And if PAX Australia is sort of woven into this sort of global event where a panel by, say, insert small Australian game developer who's working on a mobile game or a cool Switch game here, goes from having just a local Australian audience in person with 200 people tops turning up to a panel. Now it goes to having maybe 5,000 people watching because it's a global event. I mean, that's a great thing. That's a great outcome for them. So that's something I've been thinking about because CNET and GameSpot, there's a GameSpot uh we have our own show there where we host our own panels, and we're currently thinking about how we're going to do it. And I'm quite excited about the prospect of us hosting panels for a global audience. I think that'll be really cool. So I'm actually excited about that part of it, but slightly concerned and hopeful that it doesn't impact the Reed Pop guys locally too much either.
Yeah, I mean, like that was the biggest change that actually came in last year was not anything that happened on the ground floor at PAX Australia, but it was the inclusion of a Steam festival for a couple of days just for PAX Australia. So the amount of wish lists, especially for the devs that were already had like pre-order or ability to buy, like the instant conversion rate that they had off that infinitely outstripped anything that they got from PAX Australia at all. A lot of indie devs would often, tell me, and I'm sure they told Mark and pretty much anybody else, if you over the last 4 years, if you see the ones regularly, they get more money from merchandise than they actually do from selling their video game, right? Because that's partially, there's more of an impulse buy on like sort of pins and sort of tickets and cool little things than they are in investing in a video game, especially if that video game looks early access. But you put it out to Steam, like instead of hitting like maybe 40, 50, 60,000 people who might want to buy on the show floor, and now you're hitting like a user base of 150 million, 160 million every day. Like that's a vastly different proposition. And I'd also heard that the price of indie booths had gone up this year, um, amazingly, which already makes it hard. Like, it's difficult for indies to find investment to travel to shows as is, especially if they don't have local grants. But now that everything's gone virtual, they don't have to book that cost. They can hit a bigger audience that they wanted to hit anyway, that PAX Australia wasn't really going to supply them. And if they choose to do something virtual, now they get access to a different platform that can feed into that. It's kind of really only a win-win for the local developers, even though that means that their voice increasingly goes overseas and doesn't really focus on Australia at all, which is sad.
Was it not and this may have just been the timing for last year, wasn't it also tied in with the Melbourne Game Developers Week?
It always is. So PAX is always at the end of Melbourne International Games Week. Um, Last year wasn't any different on that regard.
But this year, had they made any announcements around about is there a potential impact there in terms of not having that convergence?
Yeah, I think so. I think not having that ability to, if you're an indie, for example, having the space to talk to other developers, potential publishers, the sort of like networking that goes around events like these. I think a lot of that will be lost. Um, but I think that impact is minimal compared to the ability to get a game in front of these broader, bigger audiences. That would be my guess. Not that it's a good thing that PAX is cancelled; it's a bad thing. But
Yeah.
but PAX Australia being tied up with this global thing is probably a net benefit for most developers.
Yeah, there's very much like what the community wants and what developers want, very much like what fans of games want, and those creators of those games. They're often at two different odds. I think the ones that are going to be hit the hardest are studios that were looking to not upskill, but like spin up very quickly. So one of those was Sledgehammer Studios. They're working on Call of Duty. They've always had a couple of people in Melbourne, but they officially opened a studio last year. And a week like Melbourne International Games Week is a chance for them to talk to a lot of local talent, convince them to come over or move into Melbourne, talk to places like Film Victoria, get federal funding and all the rest of that. That's much harder to do because those kind of investments people naturally don't want to make them online. You want to sit across from someone face to face, have a coffee with them before you make a call on like a 6-figure or a 7-figure investment, right? So a lot of those things have kind of like dry up when you go to a virtual festival, and it's important to recognize that like PAX and Melbourne International's Games Week kind of has those two running lanes: the developers to consumers and the industry to industry stuff.
Well, that about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Alex for making time for the show again.
Thank you for having me on.
And thanks to Mark for making his first appearance.
No problem.
Now, I suspect folks know where to find you online, but if they do want to catch up with your fine writing work, where can they do that, Mr. Walker, first?
You can find me at kotaku.com.au, and you can find me on Twitter at Dippyzuka, DIPPIZUKA.
And Mr. Serrels, likewise, same question.
Hey, you can follow me at Serrels. I do most of my writing at CNET.com, baby.
I know it well. And of course, you can catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page. And as always, thanks to everyone for listening. Adam will be back next week, and I strongly suspect I'll have a new Donkey Kong high score to chase when he does.
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.